Souls games like Elden Ring have a very long and storied history of no-hit running, where people try and beat the entire game without getting hit a single time. So when Elden Ring's DLC released, it's no surprise that many people were racing to be the first to no-hit the DLC in its entirety. There have been quite a lot of no-hit videos uploaded to YouTube in the last few weeks, but there was one that caught my eye more than the rest. A no-hit speedrun that was achieved just 9 days after the DLC was released. Getting this run this early into the game's release is incredibly impressive to say the least. But after I began excitedly watching the run, I started to notice some things that were very interesting. So I thought today I would go through this run with you guys and break down just how crazy this run really is. Because it truly is crazy, just maybe not for the reasons you might expect. But before we start, a quick disclaimer. Do not go and harass anybody mentioned in this video under any circumstances. The purpose of this video is not to start a witch hunt, and bullying people over the internet is way more cringe than anything this guy does in his funny little speedrun. Got that? Okay, good. This run starts off very simple, just running around doing some simple item collecting. But the first interesting part is how he gets the weapon that he's going to use for the rest of the run. He wants to use the Blood Fiend's arm. It does insane amounts of damage, combining huge charged R2 damage with insane bleed buildup to just melt the bosses. The Blood Fiend's arm is a guaranteed drop from this guy right here. But he's inside of a massive group of enemies, so just running up to him and killing him is a very unsafe strat. So what does our runner do? Well, he buffs up and then he runs up and just kills the enemy. Then he runs into this corner and Memory of Grace is out to get away quickly. This strat is incredibly dangerous for many reasons. The most obvious example of why this is so unsafe is this guy right here, who is right behind him after he uses the Memory of Grace. This enemy chooses to do a big scream attack, which is very slow and poses no threat to our runner. But if this enemy chose to do any other faster attack, then our runner would have been hit almost guaranteed. You are not invulnerable whilst using the Memory of Grace. You can still be hit here. But hey, the enemy chooses to play nice, so he gets to Memory of Grace out. No big deal, right? Then there's this moment in Castle Ensis. He sprints past a dog and a Black Knight, and whilst they're attacking him, he grabs the wrong item from the cross. Then he runs up and grabs the correct item, the fragment that he wanted, then just grabs the Grace in front of these enemies, using the Grace iframes to not get hit. He then jumps over the fence and Memory of Graces back to the Grace. Again, this is just unbelievably risky. If this enemy decided to swing a little bit later, the hitbox of his hammer could be inside of the player at the exact moment that he loses his invulnerability. And this would result in him getting hit instantly with nothing he could have possibly done about it. But perhaps the craziest example is this part right here. There's this room with a bunch of Kindred of Rot in it. If you try and just run through this area, these enemies shoot pest threads at you. They just spam it over and over, making it almost guaranteed that you will get hit. There's a strat to get past these enemies with certain abilities like Assassin's Gambit or Unseen Form. Just pop the ability and get on your horse and you can run right by. But here is the strat that our runner chooses to use in this room. What the fuck? This clip, this is just, I don't even know where to begin with this one. He just runs up to the guy on a horse and then spins in a circle and hits the enemy. And the pest thread attacks just miss him, I guess. He even misses a swing which lets the enemy shoot a second projectile at him, which he also dodges by just spinning in a circle. This is not a consistent dodge. I feel like that should go without saying. I went and tried to spin these pest threads myself, and I got it to work like 1 in every 10 attempts. And bear in mind that he is doing this strat 34 minutes into a no-hit run. But if you're not very familiar with Elden Ring, or no-hit running in general, then maybe this doesn't seem all that strange to you. There's RNG in lots of speedruns, right? So why is this so different than the RNG that you see in other games? Well, let me just just show you. This is a no-hit runner called Geno Machino. He's no-hit Elden Ring a million different times with a million different restrictions. Some people might say that he's slightly good at this video game. Here is how Geno and other no-hit runners like him get through Stormveil Castle, one of Elden Ring's first legacy dungeons. First, he uses Assassin's Gambit, an ash of war that makes his footsteps completely silent and makes it harder for enemies to see him. Then he runs past this first set of ballista guys. He makes sure to crouch right after going past this tree to make sure that no enemies can see him. He grabs this bonfire for later, and then he runs behind these guards. Up next is these two ballista guys. Running through these ballista guys by just spam rolling is possible, but it's incredibly inconsistent. So instead, Geno does something clever. He uses Assassin's Gambit, then he uses a bow to line up a shot behind the first ballista guy's head. He then throws a kukri at that exact angle so that it hits the wall behind the guard. This kukri will distract this guard and force him to turn around and let go of the ballista. He then throws a second kukri at this wall to distract these enemies here. Then he runs into this little corner, which makes the top right ballista guy fire his shot and miss, so he can then run straight through these next guards. He makes sure to kill this guy as he runs past him, because this guy has a projectile attack that can clip him as he runs away if he gets unlucky. He then uses Assassin's Gambit one last time to sneak back into this room with the Grace. He's now past all of the danger in the castle, and he's ready to fight Godric the Grafted. This strat isn't super complicated or anything, but it is incredibly safe. Instead of just hoping and praying that the enemies don't do nasty things to you, you can instead have a strategy that will work every single time without fail, so long as you execute it properly. Simply put, good strats work 100% of the time when you do everything right, and bad strats only work half the time, even if you do everything perfectly. So hopefully that demonstrates just how wild and unsafe these strats really are. And the run is littered with them, and the unsafe strats show up in his boss kills too. He seemingly doesn't really know where the safe punish windows on the boss are. There's quite a few of these, but the most crazy one happens on the Golden Hippo, where with just one single tick of stamina, he goes for a jumping R2 on the boss as he phase changes. And the projectiles on the phase change just conveniently fall all around him, missing him entirely. Definitely a super safe and repeatable boss kill, surely. Now you might be thinking to yourself, but Htwo. This run was achieved just 9 days after the DLC released. Sure, maybe his strats aren't super refined, but that might just be because it's a super early run. Maybe he just got lucky on some strats. This doesn't prove that the run isn't legit. Well, you are absolutely right. These strats are incredibly scuffed, but that doesn't prove that this run isn't legitimate. But unfortunately, I do have something that does prove it. Take a look at this clip and pay close attention to the audio. Did you catch that? Let's take one more listen. You might have noticed that the audio doesn't transition too smoothly in the background there. Sort of just cuts in and out abruptly. Just as a comparison, here is a clip of me sitting at that exact same Grace. And if that didn't convince you, then here is a spectrogram of that audio as a visual aid. And this spectrogram very clearly has a cut directly in the middle of it, which is surefire evidence of what speedrunners like to call splicing. Splicing is where you take multiple different runs and splice them together in an editing software to try and make it look like one continuous run. The black screens that occur during loading screens or when you sit down at bonfires are the perfect cover for a splice. But the black screen, of course, doesn't save you from having very obvious cuts in the audio. This Grace right here is the most noticeable audio splice in the entire run, but you can hear it in other places too. You hear it at the Grace before basically every single boss fight. And you also hear it at a bunch of running sections too. So this is the real explanation as to why he has seemingly no plan at all for so much of this run. He just makes a save state at whatever bonfire he just sat at using mods, and then he reloads that save state over and over again until he gets the next section of the run just right. He doesn't need his strats to be consistent at all. He only needs to hit it once. And these splices also explain a lot of other weird things that he does in the run too. This is supposed to be a speed run, according to the title, yet he will regularly take 5 seconds to just sit at a random bonfire just to like level up his endurance once. Or sometimes literally for no reason at all. These rests make 0 sense in a hitless speedrun, until you consider how these rests are perfect black screens for splicing your run. There's also a few quit outs with the same issue too, like here, where he runs up to this mini-boss enemy and quits out immediately as he aggroes. You might think this is to just de-aggro the enemy, but then the moment he loads back in, the enemy instantly re-aggroes, and is further up the stairs and more in the way than it was before. So this quit out wasn't a strat to de-aggro the enemy safely, it was seemingly just random, until you again realise that this quit out happens right after one of the longest and most difficult running sections in the entirety of Elden Ring. Now, there's something I do need to mention here, because I am not the first person to notice that this run is spliced. Lots of people were calling him out in his comments for a while, only to have their comments hidden or deleted entirely. But that all changed when a popular no-hit runner called the Happy Hob chimed in. He left a comment that calls out the runner for splicing his run, and that seemed to be the last straw. And after that, our runner came clean and admitted that the run was spliced and apologised for it. He then changed the title to reflect that, mentioning that the run was segmented. Now, I saw this change of heart and I considered just completely dropping this video idea, because you know, he's like seen the error in his ways and come clean, and that's just the end of the story. But that was until I noticed a few other things. First off is the rest of his YouTube channel. His entire channel is dedicated to challenge running video games. He has an Elden Ring DLC Deathless run, achieved just 2 days after the DLC released. An insanely fast output for a run like this that would be insanely impressive if it wasn't also very blatantly spliced. A deathless run is a lot easier to get than a hitless run, so the splices are a lot more few and far between in this run. But they are there. There's also his Elden Ring no death speedrun, uploaded to YouTube just 6 days after Elden Ring initially released in 2022. And this, too, is spliced. He also has a Lies of P no death speedrun, also spliced. And yet these videos do not say segmented in the title, and they've attracted next to no criticism, unlike the hitless run that everyone's been clowning on. They likely attracted less attention because they're deathless runs, not hitless runs. And deathless is a category that's a lot easier and less competitive. And your strats don't have to be nearly as safe or clean on a deathless run, because getting hit for like 10 damage doesn't really matter. So these ones flew under the radar. His channel also has a bunch of other runs from other games on it too, and I'm not really familiar enough with these games to tell you whether these runs are spliced or not, but he's clearly shown that he likes to splice his runs, so it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if some of them were cheated. But all of these other spliced runs are not the only suspicious thing I noticed. I also noticed one last thing that seemingly nobody else has commented on, and that is this running section here at Inir Elim. He does his classic strategy of Unga Bunga sprinting past enemies and just jumping around and praying to the Lord that he doesn't get hit. And that works out for him, until he reaches this door, which he just runs up and opens. Whilst opening a door in Elden Ring, you get iframes. You are immune to damage whilst you're opening the door, which you can clearly see as this enemy shoots projectiles at him that don't do any damage. But then, something crazy happens, and at full speed, it looks like this. Which might just look like a pretty lucky, well-timed roll, but why don't we slow it down a bit? This frame, right here, is crazy. If you didn't know, your iframes on opening a door end the second your character is actionable. The moment you regain control of your movement, you are able to take damage. His character is stood upright with his weapon out, with a projectile directly inside of his body, slicing him in two, and yet he takes no damage. You might be thinking to yourself, oh, but he rolls right after the door opens, right? So it's fine because you've got wrong. When you roll in Elden Ring, you don't gain invulnerability until about 2 frames into your rolling animation. And you can see that on the very first frame of his rolling animation, this projectile is very much inside of him. This projectile should have hit him, and yet it doesn't. Now, I may be wrong, but I'm pretty confident that this is evidence of this runner using mods to give himself invulnerability to make getting these running sections right a little bit easier. And because this moment happened so fast, he just hopes that nobody will notice. Now, I thought maybe this could be explained by the hitboxes on this projectile being weird or something, so I tested it myself. And this hitbox hits me just as you would expect it to. The visual of the projectile and the hitbox of it line up just fine. Now, if anyone who's super knowledgeable about Elden Ring has a different explanation as to how he doesn't take damage here, then please do leave a comment and tell me, because I would certainly like to be wrong here. Because it's one thing to splice a run, but it's a whole other thing to use mods to make yourself invulnerable for the hardest running sections in the entire game. So yeah, as much as this guy did admit to splicing the run, I don't think putting segmented in the title really does it justice. So sadly, this run really was too good to be true. Just 9 days into the DLC, this run was not actually achieved legitimately. And if the obvious lack of strats and obvious audio splices didn't give it away hard enough, then straight up enabling God mode might have really sealed the deal. But before I go, I'd just like to once again reiterate to not go and harass this guy. Yeah, cheating is really cringe, but what's even more cringe is harassing people over the internet. So if you were excited to see Elden Ring DLC no-hit runs, maybe just give it a little while longer before one of the more acclaimed and trustworthy no-hit runners uploads the first no-hit of the DLC. Thanks for watching.